Thank you for joining us on this webinar on transitioning from in-person to blended, developing your blend. My name is Kana Shiota. I'm the lead instructional designer here at NovoEd, and I'm here today to talk primarily about the experience of transforming a fully in-person experience into a blended one. So I hope that's what you're here for today. Let's get started. So if you have any questions today during this presentation, I invite you to share them via the chat box in the right-hand side, and we'll be recording this webinar and will be distributed to everyone after the call. So I'd actually like to start today with a bit of a story, a personal one actually. So it's a story about the sushi burrito. And as background, I'm Japanese and I love sushi, the traditional type of sushi, you know, that's bite-sized and has a little bit of fish at the top. That's just, I think it's a great culinary masterpiece of sorts. So a few years ago, I was introduced to this new phenomenon called the sushi burrito. I don't know how many of you have heard of this before, but it's essentially a huge burrito that's wrapped up in the seaweed and has all of the components like the fish inside this burrito-like form. And when I first heard about it, I was very dismissive of it. I didn't like the idea. I kind of felt like it was a lesser version of what I know to be sushi. But one day a friend of mine decided, you know, let's just do it. Let's just go for it and try it out. And I did. And the funny thing is, I absolutely loved it. It was a great experience. It was different. It was not the sushi that I was used to, but it had some of the familiar components like the rice, the seaweed, the fish. And it also had some components that were unfamiliar but great in its own way. It was very convenient in its to-go type format in this burrito, and it was also fairly cheap for considering that it was sushi. And the reason I'm telling you this story today is because I think for many of you who are transitioning or thinking of transitioning from a fully in-person experience to an online one, it might feel a little bit similar to how I experienced the sushi burrito. You're very familiar with in-person training, you know its strengths, it's already produced good results for you, and it feels a little uncertain to try something new. So today, the purpose I have for this webinar is to introduce you to this concept of taking the first bite of the sushi burrito, something new, a combination of different elements. Because I think when you consider blending different types of training, like in-person, like on-the-job training, webinars, study groups, e-learning modules, any number of things, when you combine all of those different elements together, it can create a completely new experience that is just as good, if not better, than things that you have experienced before. So that's my agenda here today. So today we'll be covering together the question of why blended, why is it important to consider. Then I'll be spending the majority of our time on a case scenario where we'll be talking about translating a fully in-person experience into a blended one. And then we're going to analyze that scenario using a blending framework, which you can reapply to your own blended scenarios later on. And finally, we'll make some time for Q&A to answer those questions that you've been entering into the chat box. All right, let's dive in. The first thing is around a poll. I'd like to ask all of you on this call today, why are you considering a blended program? Or why are you already doing one? Essentially, what do you feel are the benefits of blended learning? So we're going to open up this poll in just a second. Please tell me, just give a few seconds for everyone to select one of these responses. Are you considering blending because it results in stickier learning? Because it's more cost effective? Or maybe because it allows for more flexibility for the learner to access their learning in different ways? Or perhaps you are working with a lot of millennials who want that blended in-person component. Or perhaps you're just seeking to reinforce some of the learning in between some existing in-person experiences. All right, I'm seeing a lot of responses come through. Thank you, everyone. It's looking really great. Let's just give 5 more seconds for everyone to respond. Okay, now I'd like to show the results of what I'm seeing here right now. There we go. The results are showing. Looks like the majority of us are trying it because it allows for more flexibility for the learner. Absolutely agree. The results in stickier learning. Yes, because you're allowing learners to access and apply their learning in all different formats. And also reinforcing learning. This is actually very common for our clients. They're seeking to add something new onto the in-person experiences that they already have. I'm actually surprised to see that not as many of you chose the cost-effective one. I actually hear this most often from our clients, but happy to talk about that soon. All right, let's move on. Thanks everyone for answering. So I think it's pretty clear to us why a lot of us are interested in blended learning. But now the real question is how? How do I begin that redesign? How do I think about moving a great in-person experience and reworking that, reimagining it to a blended one? In order to make this come to life, I'd like to share a case scenario. So let's imagine that you are the training manager and you're working at a global company that sells a certain product. You have a huge dispersed team of call center agents across the country, across the globe, and you are in charge of their new hire training. And currently, this training is delivered as a 5-day in-person training at each individual field site. So it's happening with different trainers across different areas. But you have a problem. This 5-day in-person training appeared to be working pretty well, but this year you're facing some budget cuts. You're facing inconsistent trainer delivery, as in some regions are performing better than others in terms of the trainer qualifications. And you also are experiencing some declines actually in the agent performance, their call center performance in terms of customer experience reviews, as well as time to resolution on the calls that they're on. So it seems like the new hire training could be improved in some of these ways. So you've taken this webinar though, and you say to yourself, I know the solution. It has to involve some type of blended because I'm facing these types of budget cuts and inconsistent deliveries. I've got to try to maximize a more limited portion of in-person training so that I can utilize some online components that will help me meet these problems. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the topics that are inside your new hire onboarding currently. The first one might be about company culture. Your new hire is obviously new to the company. They want to know what matters here at this company, what are their goals, what are the objectives that the company has this year and looking forward. Another one is, say, about attendance policy. Call center agents often face a very different type of attendance policy than those of us in full-time roles because they are paid by the hour. And so they have a different type of strict attendance policy that varies by region or by country that you need to cover. Another common topic is the order process. So they have to use a very specific company software in order to place the orders that their customers put in through these calls. So they need to learn the software, learn the process of how to enter their customer orders. And of course, because these are call center agents, they need to understand how to build rapport with their clients, with their customers over a call. And at the same time, they may be facing angry clients, angry customers, and they need to be able to manage those types of emotions during these calls. So there's more of this interactive, social elements of training that are involved. So let's take a look at these 5 topics, and I'd actually like to pose this question to all of you with another poll. And I'd like to ask each of you to choose which of these 5 topics, or you can choose multiple if you'd like, which of these topics would you like to see online or blended, a blended component of some online, some in person? Which would you choose? Let's take a look at what people are telling us. All right. Thank you, everyone. We're going to close the poll at this time and show you the results. Okay, as expected, I'm seeing a lot of people answered the attendance policy, the company culture piece, and the order process technical piece to blend online. Not as many as a fraction in terms of the interactive experiences of creating rapport and managing emotion. So this is actually fairly common and what I would have expected. So let's actually, I'd like to share that this is probably what most of you would have expected. But I also want to share a kind of more surprising detail around why something like, say, creating rapport, which is a lot more of a interactive topic, and how that can be translated into an online blended experience, because I think that's something most of us haven't experienced before or haven't seen as much. So let's actually dive into this topic of, hold on, give me just a moment. Thank you, of creating rapport. How might this session, building rapport, look as a blended experience? Because most of you didn't choose it, I'd just like to show an example of what it could look like. So let's imagine this topic of creating rapport is about, recognizing the importance of building rapport, identifying how to use your voice to establish it, applying active listening and questioning techniques, utilizing a matching and mirroring style to create rapport. So all of these feel very interactive, very active in terms of, if you can imagine this as a classroom session, there would be a lot of role play, a lot of immediate feedback. So let's take a look at, let's say this building rapport session used to be a 3.5-hour session in person. What could this look like blended? So I put out an example here of what that might be. Let's imagine you start with a pre-reading and plus a video and online discussion. This is where you're going to get some of the factual information, some of the readings, the video about why building rapport is important. What kind of personal experiences have you had around building rapport? And then you're going to follow up that pre-work with an in-person experience. Let's say you're going to have the 1.5-hour interactive session led by a subject matter expert in each region. That person is going to maybe start with an inspiring story, play you a clip about a real customer interaction with a call center agent and how that call center agent turned things around for a customer. And then, of course, you're going to expect this. You're going to have some role plays between new call center agents receiving feedback from the expert, from each other, as they do continuous more role plays to practice what they've just learned. But then what follows here is interesting. Most in-person sessions would end here and say, go back to your workplace, do your thing. Now here we're going to continue this journey and add in some additional online content to reinforce that learning. In this case, possibly an e-learning simulation. So a simulation with multiple pathways and responses. We're going to talk about responding to a particular customer's concerns through an e-simulation. And you're going to have some discussions online where people are going to comment and write in about how they felt about the e-learning simulations and what they learned. And then we're going to follow that up with what's most critical, I think, the on-the-job activity. We're going to follow through on that by asking these new hires to go back into the workplace, test it out, analyze the recordings of their calls, and use a rubric that they have developed to see how they did according to the topic of creating rapport. How did they do? And then they're going to actually submit online how their self-reflection of how they did on this on-the-job activity. They're going to receive feedback from their peers and their instructor, possibly even their manager on this online format. And they get to keep and review this virtual feedback that they've received. I think this is critical to kind of complete the loop in virtual training. To get the feedback that they need and to apply it using that 70-20-10 type model where they're going back into the workplace, applying it in order to make that learning stick. So this is how something like an interactive topic of creating rapport, could be even more effective as a blended experience versus a fully in-person experience. Okay, so now let's analyze this case scenario that we just talked about of the new hire training, and I'm going to analyze the decision points in it using a framework. For the purposes of this webinar, this framework is a little bit simplified. So if you have any follow-up questions, I invite you to share them into the chat box. So this blending framework, I'm going to answer two questions using it. The first is around how much should I blend? For example, if you have a 3-day in-person training, are you hoping to take 1 day in person and convert 2 days worth of training into an online experience? Or are you hoping to keep most of that 3-day person intact and then only add in a little bit of content to make it blended? What should that balance be for you versus the in-person and the online components? We're going to seek to answer that question using this framework. And the second question we hope to answer is around which content pieces to blend. Like the earlier example, if you have a list of different topics and sessions, which ones are you thinking of bringing online into the online medium? That's a key decision. Let's actually begin by answering the first question, which is how much do you blend? I think really here there are 3 key considerations. And again, this is simplified. These are not all the considerations that you have to think about, but I think they are some of the most important. So let's start with the first one, which is budget. The budget you have for development. I think creating new online and blended content doesn't surprise most of you, but it does cost money and people resources to do that. I think if anyone tries to tell you that creating a blended experience is cheap, is probably a little bit misinformed about what it takes to create a great blended experience. And so I'm saying, oh, it costs money, it costs people. Why do people even want to do it? I think the key here is that this cost is upfront. You pay it once, and then you reap the rewards of that reduced cost for a much longer period of time. And so, for example, across the clients that we've worked with here at NovoEd, those who have transformed a fully in-person experience into a blended experience have achieved up to 50 to 70% cost reduction for each program run, which is very significant. So again, first, keeping in mind how much budget do you have for development, and that influences how much of your content can you take online. The second is around how much lead time do you have until your desired launch date? Because changing an in-person, especially a great in-person experience, into a blended one isn't just about taking those PowerPoint slides that you had earlier and slapping them onto a storyline articulate type video and giving it a voiceover. I think it takes a lot of time to think about the learning objectives, reimagining them, evaluate the learning methodologies and the technologies that are in existence in order to achieve those learning objectives. And then after you choose those methodologies or technologies that you're going to use, then to redesign that learning content to live well in that new medium. It takes some time and expertise in order to do that. So, for example, if you're working with a tight timeline, it doesn't mean that you can't do blended. It means that you may be working with a smaller subset of your content to get started. Okay, and the third one I'll speak to is about stakeholders, around are your stakeholders ready to embrace these new methods? I usually find that talking about the cost effectiveness of blended learning is enough to kind of perk up the ears and get them to support it. But it's very possible that your stakeholders are also wary of new technologies or, messing with the tried and true in-person delivery mechanisms. And in that case, you could start with a conservative blend, as in only transforming a few or smaller elements of your training to an online medium and keeping the majority of your in-person training. Or another approach I like to recommend if you want to, try out the full effectiveness of blended is to start with the idea of a pilot. I find that most stakeholders actually appreciate and like this word pilot. It's kind of starting small, seeing how it works with a smaller subset of your target population, measuring the impact, and then seeing if it's ready for a larger rollout or for higher levels of blended design. So again, how much stakeholder support you have will probably influence how much of your content you're going to move online in order to make a blended experience. So to review, there were these three factors to consider. One, budget. The second, around the time, lead time you have until launch, and the stakeholder support you have. And there's really no magic calculator here to say, low budget, lots of time, a little bit of support equals what percentage. But I think by considering these three factors, you will find your own balance about how much of your in-person training you're going to choose to make blended. Now let's talk about this second question around which content to blend. We talked earlier about that example of you have a list of topics and scenarios, topics and modules that you're considering keeping in person or blending, and how do you make that decision? Which of those content pieces are you going to take? I like to start this analysis using Bloom's taxonomy. For those of you who aren't familiar with Bloom's, it's a model that's used to classify learning objectives into levels of complexity. So for example, you'll see at lower levels, these are learning objectives related to simple recall of facts and basic concepts. And as you move up the ladder, learners will be asked to use that information in new ways, apply it in different contexts. And as you go further up, the more complex the cognitive tests become that we're asking of them. And so, for example, if you were to look at learning objectives that kind of fall into these taxonomy levels, I'm going to use a high school physics example so that we can all relate. So at one level, at the bottom level of remember, it might sound like by the end of this lesson, the student will be able to recite Newton's 3 laws of motion. And as you go up the ladder, you might find things around the student will be able to calculate, so being able to apply that learning, and all the way to the student will be able to design an original homework problem. So they're really creating something new. They're combining these learnings that they have into a new idea. So you can see how the complexity rises as you go up the ladder of Bloom's taxonomy. So how do I use Bloom's taxonomy to choose which topics to blend? As a general rule of thumb, I like to start at the bottom and work your way up. And by that, I mean the learning objectives at the bottom of Bloom's are generally more easily translatable and immediately translatable online. And I think this supports the reason why most of you instinctively in the earlier poll chose some of the more simpler or more fact-based topics to bring online. It's because of this, because you instinctively understand this concept. And you're seeking to flip the classroom here and maximize that precious and expensive in-person time to use it for its strength. So using in-person time for more interactive topics, for the immediate feedback, for that bonding time. And by flipping the classroom and engaging some of these remember and understand type learning objectives online, you make more time for yourself to do the higher order learning objectives inside the classroom. But then let's think about if you have a mandate to blend more of your learning, more than just the basic recall type topics. I think this is actually where it gets really fun and interesting. So when you're trying to do things like the apply, the evaluate, the create online, how do you do that? And these learning objectives that fall into this higher level of Bloom's is more complex by definition. But I also think because it's more complex, it's even more important to have this blended, multi-pronged approach to learning at these higher levels, because the learners need to apply that learning, they need to use it in a variety of different situations or to fully internalize. And I think this is why when we fall into that trap of thinking that in-person training is the only way to do some of these higher order things, this is where we fail. And this is because without that component of following through, without that 70% of that 70-20-10 in terms of applying what they're learning inside the workplace, it follows through. And we just let them go after the classroom experience. We hope that they had, this great learning and people feel good about their in-person experiences, but then they don't apply it. And by blending these higher order experiences, we can ensure that people are applying it and then coming back, reporting on it through other learning methods and following through on that learning. And the reason why I didn't recommend starting with these higher order taxonomy levels is because it generally requires a little bit more effort and time and more expertise in project-based learning in order to create a blended experience that attacks these levels. And oftentimes, it also requires a little bit more stakeholder support too, because you're asking learners to do things outside of the classroom bubble. But if you're able to get through all of that, on the upside, I think you can achieve much stickier learning. You're going to appeal to the learner and where they are. And you'll probably achieve even more cost savings by moving some of these higher order learning components into a blended experience. So now we're about to close this webinar, and I just wanted to share a few tips or repeat some of the things that I mentioned here today. So first thing is starting with the idea of a pilot. If your stakeholders don't seem ready, or if this is a new concept for you to do online blended learning, I would say test it out, experiment, start with something small. I think that will prove to you that blended learning has a lot of great upsides that you can benefit from. Use that blended framework that we talked about today. I think we talked about the question of how to choose which topics to blend and how much to blend. And that blending framework will help you reach those decisions. And third and finally, after you create your entire blended experience, you can examine the whole experience. And by that I mean, from a learner's perspective, you may have a lot of puzzle pieces to create a blended experience, but all of them should fit together nicely to create a whole picture. And it's always important as you create different components of a blended experience that they all fit together seamlessly into one picture. Okay, so I think we're just out of time. So I want to thank everyone for joining us on this webinar today about blended learning, and we hope to see you again for a future webinar here at NovoEd.